Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon. And as you'll discover in this brief so-called overview, I have as many questions for you as I have answers. I will be just a little bit parochial, I must say. I am Canadian, as you've heard, and much of my experience of registries was developing the Canadian registry, but its history might be helpful or illustrative to you. As we commonly do these days, I'll list my potential conflicts of interest. So as you see, I've done consultations with research sponsored by, lectures in venues put together by a whole lot of dodgy people. And it's meant to say, I suppose, that I have so many conflicts, I have no conflicts at all. What do registries do? I think that's about the best place to start, and it's a bit challenging, and registries are all a little bit different, but I think they do have one essential function that they share. Are there drawbacks? And I've become aware recently that there are potential drawbacks or hazards to running a registry, and I'd like to share those thoughts with you and get your feedback. And then finally, how do registries survive? Who pays the bills? And I want to challenge the audience to give some thought to that and to give some thought to your role in that. So what is a registry? And in presentations, as you know, speakers will often go to the dictionary. I've gone to the internet, and immediately, of course, I become confused about what is a registry. It apparently has something to do with the Windows operating system, and it was very, very challenging. Presumably, that's not the registry we're talking about. A registry is apparently a place where registers or records are kept, which sounds reasonable enough, if a bit bland and uninformative. And then you look at this dictionary's example, which is a bit chilling. MI5 maintains a large registry of files on individuals and organizations, and I assume that's not what's meant either. And then finally, in common parlance, at least in Canada, the place I hear the word registry most often, other than my workplace, is amongst the brides-to-be, that is bridal registries. So people seem to sign into registries with the notion that they're going to get something, or a whole lot of nicely wrapped up somethings. And unfortunately, it's not true in the case of Alpha, at least not unless you're really, really patient about the outcome of research. So what does a registry really do? And I think the best example to begin is one you've already seen the results of. There was the large American NHLBI registry that ran through the early 90s, kept track of almost 1,000 patients with alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, and came up with some pivotal findings. And in case you're not accustomed to reading these graphs, on the x-axis at the bottom, we see people whose FEV1 started at the nearly normal range, a few people whose FEV1s were rather terrible, but the largest group of patients were there in the murky middle with moderate obstruction. And those two lines represent patients who, here at the top, had received augmentation infusions, or at the bottom, who had not received augmentation infusions. And the y-axis tells us that the people receiving the augmentation infusions lost FEV1 more slowly. It was a pivotal finding, and as you've heard John Edelman mention, it was accompanied by the finding that survival was rather good in patients over the 5 years if they received augmentation, but it was not very good if they did not receive augmentation. And many of us would think, well, there's the answer, there's what augmentation therapy does. It's a pivotal finding, we don't have to go much further. Except, of course, that these are observational studies. We don't know why or how these particular patients arrived at their treatments, and the results could be confounded. And it's commonly suggested, for example, that the American patients receiving intravenous augmentation therapy were of higher socioeconomic status, had better insurance, and there were a number of other factors that accounted for that better outcome. So at around that time, I began to enter the alpha-1 field, and it was courtesy of at least one of my colleagues who's sitting at the table over there, Rob Stockley, but also you've just heard from Jan Stoke, people who were putting together an international registry, the AIR registry, aiming at gathering up data from a large number of countries in a rather standardized way, using standardized approaches and questionnaires and a standardized database. This example is of a publication describing AIR after its first several years of operation. It was at about the time that the AIR group was forming that the Bayer Blood Products Company, or Bayer Company, invited me to go and visit the group, see if this was applicable in Canada, and if possible, to set up at a Canadian registry. So we did with our first very rudimentary website, and it remains, I must say, a bit rudimentary, but it became known amongst Canadian respiratory physicians and those in the respiratory community that we were interested in gathering up alpha-1 data. And one of the first observations we made was a bit of a counterpoint or complement, if you will, to the large NHLBI registry database. The concern in the American system without universal health care was that their results were confounded. We had to look at our own registry for data, comparing loss of FEV1 in patients who did not receive augmentation therapy. It was an average of more than 60 mLs per year loss, or patients who did receive augmentation therapy, and there the loss was in the more normal range at about 30 mLs per year. And in the Canadian system, where access to healthcare is universal, we thought our results were likely to be less confounded. And it stimulated us to go forward, and with Rob Stockley, we put together all the data we could from all of the observational studies and trials that measured FEV1 in augmented and non-augmented individuals. And here's a key graph from our meta-analysis. To the right of this line, and it seems to have shifted for some reason on my slide, but to the right of this line would be augmentation therapy preserving FEV1, to the left, augmentation therapy not preserving FEV1, and there was a significant preservation of FEV1 in this meta-analysis. And so registries have helped to add to some of the pivotal and most quoted papers in the augmentation therapy field. And finally, you've seen this graph, and I needn't describe it in detail. This would be the 2 years of the double-blind randomized rapid trial comparing the loss of lung density in non-augmented individuals for 2 years versus the preservation, relatively speaking, of lung density in augmented individuals, and then the 2-year extension where all individuals received augmentation therapy. There were 3 Canadian centers deriving most of their patients from the Canadian registry, which by this point was relatively mature, and that accounts for more than 1/8 of the patients in the rapid trial and more than 1/6 of the patients in the extension study. So developing that registry has stimulated research and has allowed what I think is pivotal research to be done. It's had a local effect too. In Canada, the history of augmentation therapy can be told briefly. Soon after augmentation therapy was approved by our regulatory authorities, the Canadian Thoracic Society members had a look at it and said, sniff, sniff, it might be a safe blood product, but you haven't measured FEV1. This is simply something that needs more research. And as a result, if we look at the per capita use of augmentation therapy in the United States, Germany, and then Canada, as a G20 nation, we're pulling up at much, much lower rates of augmentation therapy. That's changing, and I'll just summarize a quick result from the Canadian Thoracic Society latest statement. Augmentation therapy is to be considered because of preservation of lung density, reduced mortality. And I'll highlight that because if you looked at the original article, somewhere in the midst of all of that, my name appears, which is to say, having spent 10 to 15 years gathering up alpha-1 data, I was able to make sure that that data was properly reviewed by my colleagues who are general thoracic individuals. The Canadian Thoracic Society Registry has had another dividend, and I don't want to claim credit for the work that the Alpha-1 Canada group does. It's our patient support group. But Alpha-1 Canada took shape in part because we had a repository of names and addresses, and we could send out announcements and tell people about the formation of a patient support group. And Alpha-1 Canada is a thriving organization today, and by the way, has a much nicer website than the registry has. But are there drawbacks to registries? And I want to point out that in Canada, if you were to look at the per capita registration of alpha patients by province, I'll just draw two to your attention. The two most populated provinces are Ontario, where I am, which is in about the middle in terms of registrations, and the second most populated province is the province of Quebec, a francophone province. And you see that there are very, very few patients registered from the province of Quebec. And we had a quick look to see where augmentation therapy was being infused in Canada. These are old 2008 data, but at the time they were gathered, there were lots of infusions in British Columbia and Ontario, a smattering across the Prairie provinces and the Maritime provinces, but only one patient being treated in the province of Quebec. And one consequence of our registry, which is firmly embedded in Anglophone Canada, is that the registry is largely unknown in Francophone Canada. One other potential drawback, and I'd be curious to hear your feedback, I recently saw a patient in his mid-40s. He'd been referred by a family doctor after his community respirologist had retired in ill health. The patient had dreadfully low FEV1. 8 years prior to that, when he'd first been diagnosed, it was much higher. The community respirologist had done nothing about referral or augmentation therapy. The patient, by the way, would have been covered for augmentation therapy when first diagnosed, but had no such coverage when I saw him. I wondered about this dreadful lost opportunity, and the patient pointed out to me that he'd been in our registry and said, but Dr. X, his respirologist, had been diligently sending my information to you every year. The patient had some notion that the registry was somehow monitoring his care, and that sent a chill down my spine, and I wonder how common is that notion? Do patients believe they're receiving care or monitoring from a registry? And I would love your feedback on that. Finally, how do registries survive? It takes money to run a website, to enter the data. I'll point out that, as I mentioned, I was shipped off to have a look at the AIR registries a number of years ago, courtesy of a pharmaceutical company interested in the area. We often turn to the pharmaceutical industry, or have, for their help with such research, with such interests. But I'll point out, if you haven't been watching the news, the pharmaceutical industry is under the gun. Here's one very striking example: GlaxoSmithKline, accused of bribing physicians in China. I don't mean to highlight GlaxoSmithKline. There have been lots and lots of similar issues, and as a result, there are a number of processes in place to make transparent the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and physicians. Simply to say that the traditional funding for registries, that infrastructure, is less and less going to be available from the pharmaceutical industry. Research funders tend to fund projects but not infrastructure, and we have to look closely at how registries are going to be funded if they are going to be to survive. So a quick summary: in a rare disease setting, registries facilitate research. We definitely have that achievement in the Alpha-1 field, and they've fostered much needed international collaboration. You can create champions, individuals with expertise if you found registries, but you have to balance that, because if you focus all of the Alpha-1 attention or the registry attention in one area, others will not have the opportunity to learn and to participate. Registries are often overlooked by patients, and they may be misunderstood by patients. And again, I'd like to know about my patient who thought the registry was monitoring his care. And the funding of a registry is going to be a growing challenge for us all, and I hope you take up that challenge. Thank you.